Should we make a start?
Yeah.
How do I? Right, well, thanks everyone for making the time to join us today. We're planning to talk for about half an hour about our research and our approach to this issue, with a discussion at the end, and then we'll wind it up with some concluding comments and ideas for further research. We're aiming to finish at 3:30 today because we think otherwise it's a long time to have to attend to something in this format. So that's when we aim to end. If you want to use chat as things occur to you as they're coming, as we're talking, that's fine, but we won't address them till the end because otherwise we'll sort of get distracted from the topics that we're trying to cover. But there will be hopefully enough time for everybody to join in a discussion at the end. And although we are recording the presentation, we've asked for the discussion part not to be recorded so that people can speak freely in that discussion. So the aims of today are we want to explore existing accounts of race in social work education. We'll start with talking about a literature review that we got published a few years ago about some of the dominant ways that race is talked about in social work education. We want to look at some of the limitations of the dominant understandings about race, as well as some of the existing approaches and solutions to the problem, which we think might be problematic. We're going to explore marginalisation and discrimination, and in particular the everyday processes and practices which may lead to poorer outcomes for Black students. So that's when we're going to start reporting on the findings from our recent research about Black students' experience of practice education. As Darmin said, we spoke to lecturers and Black students, but obviously within those discussions practice education came up quite a bit, and so we'll refer to that in the findings as well. And we want us all to have space to reflect on the consequences of these very everyday processes that we don't usually examine because they're such givens, the way we talk about these issues and the way we talk about race and Black students and education, that we don't generally have the time to really reflexively think about what we're doing in the ways that we talk about this issue.
And just to say, when we say Black students, we really are talking about any students that are not white. So when we did the study, we introduced it to students and lecturers as about Black and minority ethnic students. We're using the term Black students because there are no unproblematic terms, but BME is a particularly problematic way of describing a group of students.
Yeah. So just a bit about the context of the study and what gave rise to us being interested in it. We were interested in it because we had talked about these issues in the past together when we were colleagues. We'd always been interested in these sorts of issues, and we really looked at some of the literature and looked at the significant attainment gap between white, Black, Asian and minority ethnic students in UK universities. It's really clear from BASWA and SASWA, who we've put there, which is the Scottish Association of Social Work, that racism is prevalent in UK social work practice and in education. There's clear evidence about the inequalities of outcomes for Black social work students, and from Skills for Care 2021, about 33%, that's a third of social work students in England, are Black, Asian and minority ethnic. The great majority of those students pass programmes and qualify as social workers, and it's important to say that none of the students that we interviewed in this study were failing students. That's not to say they weren't facing difficulties, but that we're going to talk about in more detail, but they were all progressing well on the programmes, and they'd all done at least one practice placement before we interviewed them. As I said earlier, we did a literature review and that was published in 2019, and we looked at a lot of the existing literature about race and racism and how it's talked about in social work education literature. And what we found were these four conceptualizations. We found that racism was often talked about as if it was reproduced through subtle interactions, and I think we hear a lot about that in contemporary life, about subtle racism and so on. And we found that was quite an inadequate frame to understand what was going on in social work education, because what it tended to do was to make the issue a problem that was for individuals, and it didn't look at larger institutional structures. The other way of thinking about it that we saw was quite dominant was to talk about institutional racism, which did acknowledge the issues of institutional problems beyond individual, but was problematic because it kind of obscured some of the real issues and problems that were going on in universities and other institutions, and framing it institutional racism. It's almost something that you don't really have to explain, that it's institutional racism as an explanation doesn't really adequately address some of the difficulties that are going on. The other way, which is very dominant that we found, was racism as talking about racism, about cultural differences, about students having specific individual cultural needs, that they were either unfamiliar with the learning culture or unfamiliar with professional culture of social work. So really problematizing individual differences of students. And what we saw as a reaction to that in the literature was that often papers were written, social work academics would propose solutions to these problems. So solutions to these problems that social work students encountered, some of which we found were quite superficial and didn't really get to the heart of what was going on for students.
So, so Julie's talked about some of the dominant ways that we found this subject was being written about and researched in social work. And what we wanted to think about was ways of understanding race and racism that are being used elsewhere that maybe haven't had much traction in social work research yet. So we've drawn a lot on the work of Alana Lentin, and she describes things that other people in sociology are writing about as well. And one of these things is that if when we're doing research about racial inequalities, we focus on racism, then there's already a problem there, because there's no way of talking about racism in sociology or in social work without already having this idea that we're talking about a moral problem, a question of immorality. Racism is always talked about as if it's bad, as if it's about an immoral act, an act that is abusive or violent. And of course, lots of racism is, so we're not suggesting that we should have a different understanding of racism, but all sorts of other things are happening that reproduce racial inequalities that are not about intentional, immoral or abusive acts. There are lots of things that we do in our everyday practice that sort people into different categories, that rely on implicit ideas about hierarchies, and often those are actually spoken about, they're articulated. So what Lentin says is that we need to have an attention to race. So ideas about what racial difference is, that doesn't just rely on this now very old idea about biological differences. So we certainly have an understanding, a scientific understanding of racism that emerged in the 19th century, that still is influential in many kind of far-right discourses about race. But those aren't the only ways of distinguishing people from each other that operate in contemporary Britain or in liberal institutions like universities and local authorities. Those ideas about racial difference aren't the most prevalent ones. There are all sorts of other ways of thinking about people as different from each other that rely on ideas about cultural difference, about supposed differences in values in relation to gender or sexuality. That's often the way that racial difference is talked about and produced in social work contexts. They're just as powerful as these scientific distinctions, supposedly scientific, biological distinctions between people, and they rely on the same kinds of logics about a racial hierarchy as well, even though that's implicit a lot of the time. So we thought that was really important, is to draw on this current debate in sociology about how race operates and think about how that might be working in social work and social work education. And the other idea that I think we've been influenced from the start is from Sarah Ahmed's work. So Ahmed is focusing on universities, and she's focusing on how we have this discourse about diversity and inclusion, this celebration of difference in universities, but that really functions to produce the idea of the university as diverse and inclusive. So when you have situations that actually question that, people's experiences that are more about marginalisation or discrimination, then those people are treated as if they're the problem themselves. So it's very difficult to complain in this diverse, inclusive institution without becoming a problem. And that is probably a useful argument for understanding how race operates in social work practice as well as in universities. So just to tell you a little bit about the study, it's quite a small study. It's an exploratory study, so it's one that seeks to explore a topic that hasn't been discussed very much, at least recently. So we have this small body of research that Julie talked about, but that doesn't tend to take this frame, doesn't tend to focus on everyday interactions. So we've got an exploratory study. It was funded by BASWA, very kindly, and what we did was we interviewed lecturers in 2 universities in this country. We talked to 8 people here, and we talked to 19 Black and minority ethnic students in the same universities, and students were on social work qualifying programs, and the lecturers were people that taught on those programs. The lecturers were incidentally all white. We didn't seek to do that, but that was what happened, and that probably reflects the prevalence of white people in universities generally and in the social work departments in these 2 universities. And as Julie said, these students had all done at least one practice placement. They were all on course to pass their studies. So we talked about the following things. We asked people about the following issues. So when we talked to students, we asked about their experiences of teaching sessions, teaching content, how teaching sessions operated, their experiences of practice placements, what their experience of assessment and feedback was, both in placement and in university-based units. We asked about interactions between students, and we asked about their interactions with lecturers outside of teaching sessions. And we asked about the cultures in universities and in the agencies that they did their practice placements in. And then when we talked to lecturers, we asked really about what their understanding of Black students' experiences was in these different areas.
So the emphasis was on these everyday ways that we talk about students, the everyday interactions on social work programs. So we're trying to capture those everyday ways that we don't consciously think about all the time when we were doing this research. So the main themes that we identified were that students are racialized and othered in everyday interactions on social work programs. That they routinely had to negotiate experiences of marginalisation and hostility, and that was in the classroom and on practice placements, and that lecturers and practice educators both assumed that Black students were more likely to struggle with writing, with referencing, with reflection and analysis, and that influenced the assessment of their academic work and practice. And we'll talk more about this as we go along, and we've got some more detailed slides about these findings, but they were the key themes that emerged from our findings. So the first one is about the classroom and about teaching and how students were talked about. When we talked to lecturers, they often started off by saying that they thought race was a social construction, that they didn't really go along with racial categories and they critiqued them. But then they often went on to use them in uncritical ways. They relied on very simple racial distinctions to understand encounters with students in everyday situations, and common ways of constructing teaching and facilitating group learning often compounded these racial practices. So to give some examples of that, when students were in the classroom, it was often observed by lecturers and told to us in interviews that Black students would sit separately from white students. And there was a very kind of simplistic approach to explaining that. People would often say things like, well, the Cameroonian students sit together, or the Asian women students sit together. And there was some kind of very simple racial categorization going on when they described how students sat and whether they chose to sit in different places. They didn't talk about what white students' choices were. They talked about how they thought and could explain why Black students sat separately in the classroom. in terms of constructing teaching and facilitating group learning, there were often students talk to us and lecturers about case studies, and students found case studies quite problematic, and they felt othered by some of the case studies that were used. So case studies would typically draw on very simplistic sort of cultural distinctions between ethnic groups. So they would talk about FGM as an African problem, even though, for example, in most countries in Africa, it's illegal. The practice of FGM is illegal, but they wouldn't talk about the detail of that. There would be assumptions in case studies about Africa, FGM being an African problem, for example. If there were case studies about Black families, African Caribbean families, they would often be talked in terms of physical punishment of children, for example. So very simplistic approaches to these kinds of distinctions, and that lecturers making very simplistic distinctions about students in their classroom, and these having the result of students feeling quite marginalised in the class.
I was just thinking about when so much of the social work curriculum is already racialized before it gets talked about in the classroom. So a lot of these issues relate to safeguarding, child sexual exploitation, for instance, or physical punishment, or poor supervision, and FGM. These are all topics that students and lecturers bring these racial distinctions to the discussion. So when lecturers weren't dealing with that sensitively, then students often felt that they felt particularly uncomfortable with the way the discussion went. Yeah.
And I think the other thing about that was that students told us that they felt that they were often it was uncomfortable to speak out in the classroom, and that often discussions were dominated by the white students. However, when culture came up as an issue, there was an expectation that Black students were going to make a contribution to the discussion. And there were similarities and overlaps in practice education with this, where there was where students' differences were not acknowledged at all. What's sometimes referred to as a colourblind approach. It wasn't even acknowledged that there was a difference. But on the other hand, some students talked about how their differences were really reified in order to be understood as a resource. So they'd be, for example, asked to talk to the team about their culture or a cultural practice. So they're being used as a resource for learning, or their differences weren't acknowledged at all. And we can talk at the end whether you think that resonates with some of the experiences that you're aware of in practice, but we're not saying that it just happens in the classroom, and we're not saying this just happens in practice education. We're saying that it happens across the board, really.
So that's the way that lecturers often talked about these issues. When we talked to students, they spoke about some of the same processes and events that were happening in teaching in quite different terms. So if we think about that way that lecturers talked about the student groups separating into racial groups, there were differences between the ways the lecturers talked about it. Some lecturers talked about this as a way that Black students might protect themselves from racism within the student group. That might be a way of staying safe. Or some people saw it as particularly Asian female students were talked about as lacking confidence and needing to segregate themselves. So there was these different discourses amongst lecturers. When students talked to us about this issue, they didn't talk about it in terms of individual choices that students, either white or Black, made in teaching sessions. They talked about having to negotiate this question of separation when they entered the classroom. Some of them talked about it as natural grouping. Some of them talked about it as an issue of concern, but they didn't talk about choosing to segregate or not. So because of their positionality, they were talking about these group dynamics in quite different ways. And then when they told us about their interactions and relationships with other students, they had much wider groups, friendship groups and networks than lecturers seem to assume when they talk to us. So lecturers are really making these judgments based on individual relationships that they have with certain students, and then what they saw students doing in the classroom. So there were all these other interactions, either outside the classroom or going on via text and online interactions during teaching sessions that they weren't aware of, they couldn't be aware of. But students did talk to us about those things. So here are just a couple of examples of the ways that students talked about identity and about whether or not there was separation between racial groups in the student group. So this first student told us, I was born in Congo, but I've lived in Kenya, in Tanzania, and obviously England, where I went to school. So we chose this really because it illustrated something that happened with a lot of students' accounts of identity. They weren't just talking about an ethnicity, an ethnic origin, or a nationality. They talked about having different relationships with different places. And many students talked about being from somewhere else other than England, but having been to school or spent a long time here as an adult. So they didn't just talk about themselves as, for instance, Congolese. Another student within my friendship group, we've got a white Irish girl. I've got another black female friend. This is a black British student of Southern African origin, I should say. I've got another black female friend. She's from France, but her family's Nigerian. And we've got two mixed race girls and we've got two English guys in our group. So a description of a friendship group that's really mixed, actually, not segregated at all.
And I suppose just what those quotes show is how, you know, identity for Black students was much more fluid. It wasn't as fixed as lecturers presumed. It wasn't, and it certainly wasn't along these kind of very simplistic cultural or racial lines. It was much more complicated for people and in the ways that they position themselves.
Mm. So as well as this, these kind of distinctions that lecturers are making, these decisions students are having to make about how to place themselves in the group and how to negotiate these mixed situations, we also heard about these kind of normalized experiences, these everyday experiences of marginalization and hostility that happened in the classroom and in universities more generally. So one question is really about the role that informality has in social work education approaches. So this is something that lecturers tend to talk about as if it's a positive thing. We promote opportunities to discuss often sensitive issues in a sensitive way. But also the kind of informal discussions that are being promoted in the classroom might privilege some students over others. So from what students, black students that participated in the project told us about the behaviour of white students, or certain white students, was that there were these informal relationships that some students brought into the classroom. They might socialise together outside the classroom, they might drink together, and then they came into the classroom with these friendships, and those friendships meant that they talked in informal ways, in a way that excluded other students. Black students talked about having to monitor the tone of their contributions to discussion much more closely. So they told us that when they became emotional or talked about something and got upset or angry, that was viewed as either as a problem or as unprofessional. Sometimes it was talked about as if it was legitimate, but not something that professional social workers should be doing. So the implications of talking informally for black students were different than they were for some white students. And really, this is a question about who feels at home in the classroom and actually in the university generally. So we've chosen a quotation here from one of the interviews with a black student. There were students that would just talk about going for lunch with tutors and discussing the course and getting extra support on certain topics. I just thought, wow, with those students, there was a higher pass rate, they would get higher grades. But I think that's just from them having that sense of responsibility over their course and what they're doing. They'd email, they'd have meetings in person and just get further information. And we asked, do you think there's a difference in terms of ethnicity? Yes, definitely. The ones that said, I'm meeting this tutor, they were white English. The people that didn't are the ethnic minorities. So these informal relationships between students and staff are also seen by some students as only available to some white people, that they feel excluded from those kind of interactions. We also found lots of evidence of quite normal processes of marginalisation and sometimes covert, sometimes overt hostility in practice placements. So because it was normal, when we talked to students about their experiences of practice placement, almost always they said they were fine. And then when we talked for a longer period or we asked specific questions, they sometimes talked about routine racist abuse from service users. Often students would talk about what was explicit racist abuse and then say, well, I didn't talk to my practice educator about it. because they viewed it as expected. They had gained this idea that they would face hostility from service users as part of a social work placement, and they needed to demonstrate that they were able to cope with that. So talking about this kind of abuse that they experienced was already viewed as putting them in a position where they would be more vulnerable, seen as not coping. But we also found examples of students that were experiencing hostility, sometimes abuse from colleagues. So being ignored by colleagues was really common. Even when students tried to establish a link with some colleagues, and they might have a good relationship with a practice educator, but not with other people in the team. Not receiving the same levels of informal support and supervision from either practice educators or other people, managers in the team, and therefore having fewer learning opportunities. And sometimes that meant that students didn't have the learning opportunities they needed to pass the placement. So we had one student who had failed a placement because of this problem, really, not being given basic opportunities to do social work practice in this placement, and then having to do another placement that they passed very, very well. We also had students that experienced ridicule or jokes about ethnicity or religion in placements that made them feel uncomfortable about interacting with colleagues.
And comments about not fitting in as well, even though they weren't specific, but just comments about we didn't think that the concern that students wouldn't fit into the team, but no specificity around that.
Yeah, which relates to really how judgments about competence are made, and we'll talk about that a bit more. This idea that really, how do you judge whether a student is good enough on placement? Often these are quite tacit judgments that the practice educators are making based on being enough like practitioners in the team. And we found that really students often talked about being in a white area. They didn't necessarily see that as a problem, but they did see it as a problem if they were experiencing racism and they were in a white team. And by that, we're not just talking about teams that only had white people in them. We're talking about teams that didn't have a way of enabling discussion about experiences of racism. And that was particularly challenging for Black students. So just to give an example of a student who was working in a very white area, experiencing some hostility and racism from service users, but had a good experience of placement. They were in what they described as a diverse social work team. And this student is saying, well, we did talk about race in general. It's quite helpful because this team here is very diverse. So they've explained what to do if somebody's racially abusing you and you're not having it. So they'll say, just be firm, don't back down, make it clear they cannot push you away by doing that. But if you really feel like it's beyond you, then go to the manager and just change your cases. So some really practical advice being given to students about how to manage these experiences of racism. The student also talked about doing a joint visit, somebody ridiculing them, racist abuse, and the colleague challenging it on their behalf in a really elegant way. So not leaving the student to deal with it, but also giving the student an example of how they can deal with it when they're on their own.
So this next few slides were about how lecturers and practice educators judged competence and capacity. And there was a bit of a preoccupation really with writing English. So lecturers described academic writing skills as if they were reliable proxies for other skills in written English when they were in practice for report writing and so on. And they also aligned it to the capacity to think critically and even to reflect. So students spoke about practice educators, this extended to how people spoke. They identified their accents as problematic and made judgments about their ability to write based on their accents. So one student said that, somebody in one of the teams that she worked in would say, I find it really difficult to understand you on Monday morning. You know, I have to attune myself to my accent, to your accent, and made assumptions from that about how the person was going to be able to write reports and so on and think critically. And that was based on accents, but also this presumption about that writing skills were going to be a problem. None of the students that we interviewed were international students, but we know that this comes up often when we're talking about, when lecturers are talking about international students. And students were left with the sense that their academic work was routinely marked down. They suspected whether work was marked anonymously, which it is usually in universities, and they just felt that it was routinely marked down because of their writing style rather than the content of what they were writing. Now, it's a bigger argument and a bigger discussion to have about what we should be looking for in social work writing and what we should be equipping students to do. But these assumptions are really problematic because they seem to be made so frequently. And then there was this kind of link about, again, just to elaborate, about judging competence and links to social work practice. So there was this real preoccupation with written English. It's more likely to be problematic for Black students. And then there were also these kind of tenuous links between written English and competence in practice. So lecturers would say, if it's not good enough, then it's not good enough. Students with poor written English will flounder in practice. They have to be able to write coherently. And there were quite high stakes that were described in this situation, that people might be more liable to, people were going to be sectioned and detained under the Mental Health Act, and that was really serious, and they might be let down because a Black student might not be able to write in English in a competent way or write the reports coherently enough. So there are these really tenuous links, we feel, between the presumption of written English and that was going to be problematic, and then their ability to be competent in practice. And then one lecturer said to us, this was about reflection. I'm generalising here. There are a lot of Black ethnic minority students who reflect very well, but there are probably more students who find it, because of the language and just the concept of reflection, find it harder to do than a student who's been educated in this country. And of course, reflection is something that's very kind of embedded in social work education. It's seen as really, really foundational in social work practice generally. But most of the models that we draw on of reflection talk about, having higher thinking skills, higher critical thinking skills. Competence in being able to reflect isn't linked in those models to who can write English well. And yet there was this kind of link to Black ethnic minority students who cannot reflect, and that was based on some assumptions about their education and so on, even though, like we said, that the students that we interviewed were not international students.
So those are the themes that we talked about. We talked about these three themes in general. This way that students are Black students are distinguished from other students. They're othered in everyday interactions in the university and on placement. And this kind of everyday experience of marginalisation and hostility that students are negotiating. They're getting through it, but that takes its toll. And then this particular focus on the assumption that students can't manage English, and that means something for their potential competence as social workers. So in terms of the discussion, we wondered whether that reflects your experiences. Do you think those things are happening in practice? Do you think there are other processes in everyday practice, in social work education? I mean, so that might be practice placements or what's going on in universities, other things that are happening that we need to be aware of too. And whatever problems are happening, what can we change, and what kind of practical changes do we need to make that happen? What do we need to improve things, to address these kind of racial hierarchies in social work education?
I suppose as well, it's important to say that, we are really trying to unearth these everyday ways that Black students are talked about. We're not outside of any of that. We are social work educators as well. And it isn't about judgment. It's about being able to have the opportunity to reflect on what we're doing in the everyday, which is resulting in students feeling marginalised. So
let me stop sharing these slides now so we can see each other.
So, Janine, do you want to turn the recording off now for any discussion, if you don't mind? Thank you.